Chapter 4. The girl started to slip into her slicker, then stopped and glanced down at the gingham dress she wore. She hesitated, and then hung the slicker back on its hook and went into the room across, and then went in towards an inner door. She passed through it, and then closed the door behind her. Pat Stephen cautiously tested his strength and his reflexes by sitting up. The upper and lower portions of his body felt unconnected, though his body retained control over each portion. He discovered that both of his holsters were empty, and he awkwardly set up to work on the buttons on his shirt and leather jacket over the bandage that Helen Higgins had placed over his wounds. He didn't try to do any thinking for the moment. There'd be plenty of time for that later, when he was safely in jail. He was damn glad Helen had insisted on riding in with them. He hadn't liked the deputy's tone when Clarence suggested that he would probably try to escape. The young man was entirely too free and easy with his ideas of saving the country the expense of the trial. He had walked right into the middle of a batch of trouble, all right. This was what Moses Higgins had hinted in his letter. Pat wished that Moses had been here a little more specific. He wondered what had happened to Moses tonight. Seemed sort of funny that neither of the young folks had even suggested conducting a thorough search outside to see if the old man was lying out there wounded. That was only one of the funny things about the whole setup. Helen re-entered the room as Pat finished buttoning his jacket. She had changed to Levi's and riding boots with short, snug-fitting sheepskin jacket buttoned tight against her girlish swell of the bosom. A floppy Stetson topped off the outfit, hiding her coiled black hair and making her every inch a boy. Pat grinned at her and said, "Thanks, ma'am, for taking this trouble to see that I reached jail alive." She replied back, "Don't mention it," and then went past him to take down her slicker. "I didn't shoot your daddy," Pat told her. "I don't know nothing about nothing. I did see some shooting while I was riding up the lane from the main road." Helen whirled about with one arm in the sleeve of her slicker. "Did anyone pass you coming out of the lane?" Pat shook his head. "Nary a soul." The look of bright expectancy faded from her young face, and she said tonely, "Well, now I know you're lying. That lane's the only way up here on the ranch, and you're the only one who could have done the shooting." "All her other feller might have hung back till I got here and then took out." "And why should I listen to you?" Helen cried back angrily. "Clarence is right. You're just another one of the Lacy gang, a two-gun killer." Pat Stevens slit his eyes and he drawled, "For a girl that thinks so much of her daddy, looks to me like he wouldn't be riding off without looking for him good outside. Suppose he'd be laying out there dying." "Is he?" she flashed at him. "I don't rightly know, but if I was you, I'd take some time for a look around before I went riding off to town." She hesitated, then shook her head. "You're just trying to trick me. Delay things until some others of your gangs get set to rescue you." "Wouldn't hurt none to look around," Pat insisted. "Might be Moses laying out there." "And you're just a wandering waddy that happens to drop in?" she cried scornfully. "How do you know that my father's name is Mose?" "Well, I heard you and that deputy calling him that." "That's a likely story. Anyway, I know he ain't out there around here close, unless he's hurt so bad he can't answer me. I went out and called after the shooting ended. That's where I was, as I guessed you know when you started hollering. I was around back looking." Pat shrugged his shoulders. "All right, ma'am. I was just trying to help." "You've helped enough, you and all your gang. You've got Dad in such a state that I never know what he's gonna do." The girl's fine black eyes filled with tears, and she turned her face away and sobbed quietly. Clarence pushed the door open and then stuck his head inside. "Ready?" Helen nodded and wiped the back of her hand over her eyes. She turned to look at Pat, asking Clarence doubtfully, "Do you think he can walk out to his horse?" "Well, I surely ain't going to be carrying him," Clarence responded sourly. He entered and stood over Pat. "Stand on your own hind legs and get out to your horse." A wave of anger swept over Pat. Under the impetus of it, he rocked forward to rest his fingertips against the floor and then lifted himself painfully. He staggered and would have fallen had not Helen stepped forward and caught his left arm. Clarence stood aside, glowering at them as Pat hobbled forward. The deputy followed into the yard and roughly assisted Pat into the roan's saddle. He took a coiled rope from behind the saddle horn and looped it around the horse's belly, securely binding Pat's feet down so he couldn't either fall or jump from the saddle. He then looped his own rope around the roan's neck, removed the bridle, and fastened the other end of the lead rope to his saddle horn. Helen had mounted her horse in the meantime, and the little procession started down the laneway away from Higgins' ranch, with Pat's roan docilely following the other two. They went along at a trot until the lead horses suddenly stopped on the brink of a ravine where the wooden bridge was washed out. Pat's lead horse trotted up beside them, and he heard Clarence declaring, "I've been telling Moses another rain would wash that dang bridge right out. How are we going to get across it?" "The bank is shallow just below the bridge." Helen reined her horse down the slope, and Clarence followed. The ravine widened abruptly, and the steep sides gave way to flat banks. The swollen stream had gone down since Pat had jumped his horse across. It was only feet-log deep as they splashed across. His roan had an easy trail trot that didn't shake his rider unduly, but every step the horse took was sheer agony for Pat. It felt as though a couple of his ribs were broken, with the jagged ends grinding against each other, and he could feel Helen's bandage slipping underneath his shirt, and could feel a fresh outflow of hot blood seeping down his thighs. He set his teeth tightly and endured the agony. Moses had written that his ranch was only 8 miles from Santa Alicia, so Pat figured a man could stand about anything for 8 miles. He wasn't worried about what would happen when he reached town and jail. He could prove to the sheriff who he was quite easily enough. The name of Pat Stevens was not unknown even down here in New Mexico. The reckless exploits of himself and his 2 gun partners from Powder Valley had almost become legend in the West, and he had papers in his pocket that would identify him pretty quick. For the life of him, Pat couldn't have said why he hadn't told Helen or Clarence's real name and his mission in New Mexico. Some instinct had warned him to keep his mouth shut and see what he could find out first. There was something damn funny going on around the Higgins ranch. From the first moment after opening his eyes on the floor of the ranch, Pat had a hunch that everything wasn't quite as it seemed. He couldn't quite figure Helen out, for one thing. That lone mounted figure he had seen riding up the lane in front of him, the shooting at the ranch. Maybe it was all he had heard Helen explain to Clarence, and maybe it wasn't. Long ago, Pat Stevens had learned to obey his hunches, no matter how fantastic and unrealistic they seemed. That was one of the reasons he stayed alive so long, while leading a hazardous existence. Time and again in the past, his hunches had saved him from stepping into a trap, and he had that feeling right now that he was on the edge of some unseen trap that could catch him tightly if he didn't watch his step. There were rifts in the clouds overhead, and stars were beginning to shine through. The rain had stopped completely, but the drenched terrain still gave off a warm, humid smell that was like the finest perfume in the nostrils of a cattleman. You could almost smell the green grass beginning to sprout on the desert floor, and you knew there was going to be a prime fat steer in the fall roundup as the result of that soaking rain. Pat Stevens got to thinking regretfully that Powder Valley could sure use a rain like that one. The grassy slopes had been pretty dry when he rode away. Nothing like the parched lifelessness of this desert sand country, of course, but mighty dry for southeastern Colorado. He wondered what Sally and Doc were doing tonight, and whether Sally had noted the absence of his gun. Sally was a mighty fine woman, but she never would get it through her pretty head that there were certain things a man couldn't turn his back upon. Old friendships, for instance. An appeal for help from an old comrade who had ridden through danger with a man in his past. Oh, Sally knew how he felt about things like that, of course, but she just refused to admit that they were important. His thoughts were rudely jerked back from their dreaming by a sharp exclamation from ahead. He lifted his head, conscious that 2 lead horses had come to the abrupt stop. In the elusive sheen of faint star glow, he saw a half-dozen mounted men grouping in the road ahead of them. Clarence reined up and demanded harshly, "Who are you fellows, and what do you mean blocking the road this way?" Rough laughter answered him from the group of riders. A surly voice answered, "It's none of your business, mister, who we are. State your names and your business." "Well, that can't be any concern of yours," blustered Clarence. "Move aside up there so we can ride through." "Not so fast," the surly voice answered. A shadowy figure detached itself from the group and rode forward close to Helen and Clarence, leaning forward to peer at them. "It happens that we're looking for a certain feller riding this way." He stopped with a sudden exclamation. "There's 3, huh? Didn't see but 2 at first." "This man's my prisoner," Clarence said loudly. "We're taking him into jail where he'll hang for trying to kill Moses Higgins tonight." The rider replied, "Do tell." He looked back at the others. "You boys, you hear that?" There was a muttered growl of absence and sinister somehow in its scarcely veiled implications. The other riders began to crowd forward, roughly jostling Helen and Clarence. "Stay back there," Clarence ordered angrily. "I'm the law hereabouts, damn it, and I'll arrest every mother's son of you if you interfere with me." "Hear that, boys?" the first rider mocked. "He'll arrest us." He laughed hoarsely and reined past Clarence to the side of Pat's roan, tipping a heavy Stetson back to look into Pat's face. Pat saw a scarred, cruel countenance in the faint starlight. A wide mouth twitched a knowing grin at him. "So, you're him," came in a cryptic murmur from the thick lips. "You don't look so tough right now. Sort of like a stray lamb being led to a butcher shop." Before Pat could figure out what sort of reply to make, he heard Helen Higgins say sharply, "I don't know what you men mean, but this man back here killed my father tonight." Her young voice shook with anger. "If you're any sort of men, you won't interfere with putting him in jail where he belongs." "A gal?" one of the night riders said in wondering voice. "This here feller's a gal." A murmur of approval, of anticipation, drifted up from the others. "See here," put in Clarence desperately. "Let me talk to one of you alone for a minute. I think we can make you—" "Should I put a bullet into this lawman, Harry?" one of the riders demanded of the man who spoke to Pat. "No use doing that. Not yet," Harry ordered sharply. "We ain't sure just what the setup is hereabouts. You take his gun off him and quirt his horse down the road towards town. We better take the gal along with us. She might come in pretty handy if she can cook." A loud growl greeted his words. "And if she can't cook," one of the followers suggested slyly. In the meantime, Clarence was being roughly handled by 2 of the armed men. Despite his loud and angry protests, he was relieved of his hardware, and the lead rope of Pat's roan was untied from his saddle horn. Then his horse was set scampering down the road out of sight, while Helen was held back on her horse. Can you make out a way to ride? Harry asked Pat anxiously. Or did you want we should make a hackamore out of the rope so you can handle your own horse? Pat Stevens felt himself reeling in the saddle from a wave of faintness, and through set lips he murmured, Lucky I'm tied in the saddle so I can't fall out, but I reckon you better keep right on leading my horse. The stars were circling about in queer convulsions overhead. Nothing made sense anymore. He was only dimly conscious of being led alongside Helen's mount, of men taking the lead and others falling in behind and turning sharply off the main road and galloping upwards into the low foothills leading off from the New Mexico desert. End of chapter 4.